All right. I feel like I'm way over in the corner, way more than we used to be with this. Slide over a little bit. What's that? You learned this on Thursday. How did you learn this on Thursday? Good. Good. That's very good. Yeah, this is going a little, I mean, we're not moving super fast, but okay. We're gonna get started. I think the first thing I wanted to do, just to check, let's see, did anybody take on this task of trying to think about what the, how you would break this down into components? Yeah, I wouldn't dare try and look at what it actually is. That's because it's using a minifier to take all of their code and get rid of everything. It probably even changes the variable names and stuff so that they're unreadable because it makes it something smaller to download to your browser. So it gets rid of all the white space, it gets rid of everything else. So
yeah, I can explain. I tried to think of ways that I would initialize or initially start doing that. But then like when I looked at the computer options, like the color part of it was really unclear and like kind of a bit like if you compare to writing together, we have colors. Like I've never seen a blue orange before. So I was very confused.
That's very weird.
Yeah, I don't know.
I was focused probably more even just on this top level portion and just like how you would break something down for these. Just like what would be some components. Now I'll give you I don't know what this looks like. I haven't looked at this at all, right? But if you have the React tools installed in your browser, the React Dev tools, you should be able to go over here and literally see, oh look, see it gave them horrible names. But you should be able to see at least what the component structure looks like in React. Again, it minified it all, so you don't get nice names. But here you can be like, oh, here's, oh, this is gonna get, they've got they're using Redux too, I believe. So it's a little more complicated as well. So it may not be quite as easy, but for your own personal ones, when they're in debug mode and you haven't built them using something that minifies, you'd be able to see your component names and stuff over here. But did anybody else tackle that? Like try and think of what the components, how would you compose this? Like what components would you use? Let's throw up some notes on another side, right next to it if I can. And how do I put stuff side by side on my Mac? Let me see if I can do this. I want another window. I don't care what this is pointed to. Close that. Get rid of this. Open a new tab. Let me see if this will work. I think it might. Oh, all right. There we go. All right, so if we've got these what type of components would you, or component structure would you try and have? Like, how would you split this up into different components? Any thoughts? We can work through it right now. An H1, but what would you, I mean, you might call it, like, let's try and think of a more semantic name for this application, if you will, right? So an H1, I mean, it can be very simple. It could just be header, right? Right? What?
Are those placed into like their own section, or are they individual?
Each one of these? That's a good question.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter how they did it. What do you think makes sense?
I feel like it's based on like the CSS of it, they should all kind of be
So we shouldn't have like a.
Like you should have like them in their own like container, but individually each of them their properties, but that container itself should have its own properties.
Okay, so you're saying we should have something that contains all of these, at a top level. All right, what should we call that? Component-wise, something that holds all of these items.
My fruits.
My fruits? You know, I mean, it works. I was thinking, I mean, this doesn't matter. It could be anything. I was just thinking products, you know, but any of it works. So then inside of that, what type of components are we putting in there, right? So that contains, that's something that contains all of these maybe. And so then how would we break it up into like components? If we're just trying to think like, how do we compose this? And a useful tool when you're trying to tackle a problem like this, trying to think, how do I build out components to build something, is, I don't want to say blur your eyes, you know, but sort of look at it from a blurry state. So don't look at the words exactly. Look at the structure that's there and start saying like, what is this structure? And what's the common patterns? So like, here's a structure. Oh, we've got something here. Like a lot of times when you're doing design work, you won't necessarily know what the structure of that is yet. And so you might just draw a box with like an X.
Yeah, that's what, like, I prefer directly drawing it out and then like labeling it on
Yeah.
the board and doing it.
Oh, I love doing that. I don't have a great layer tool to do that right now, but yeah, we could do it over there, but then anyone who's watching on video won't get to see it. So yeah, so let's say, what would we come up with a name for? Like, seems like we've got a repeating thing here, right? Something that we do over and over. What do we think that, I mean, sure, product info. Product image. Product name. Right. And you might say, you might even look at this and go, oh, you know what? These are sort of, this product info is also, it's sort of two things. It's like this image and then maybe all this is sort of together, you know? And so you might even split it up like that and create another group that's like, I don't know. I'm just making something up, right? And then these sort of go inside of there. And so what we're doing now is we're creating this structure of meaningful component names, but also generic. Like it's not like, you know, cherry info, orange info, because we need this. We want to be able to reuse this product info for each item that we render in this list. So we're looking at what are these patterns? What is this thing that's consistent between them? And then what's a good name for that object in terms of what our system is, right? Because we're going to create, if we were to build this out, which we're not going to build each one of these out, the goal here is to think about how to compose stuff like this. If we were to build this out, you would be building components that look like these, right? You probably have a product info component and a product image component, etc. And you want to reuse that, you want to use that product image component in each one of these with a different image. Does it make sense? Like how you might compose something like this and where you start, you begin to start seeing the value, right? Like I was talking earlier about how you do styling a little bit. And traditionally, right, you do styling with CSS and you put, say, class names on divs or spans or something. And you can in React. We won't dive into that just yet. Like today, we're going to keep away from a lot of the styling. But you might also begin to say, well, wait a minute. If I have a product name component and that product name component is going to render each one of these product names, and those product names have consistent styling and look a certain way, maybe I can just put my styling right in my product name component instead of having to create some CSS class somewhere else, and it sort of fits together. Oh, I know you feel offended if you're a classic person. Wait, you're putting your CSS in your HTML or your JavaScript? What are you, a horrible person? Yeah, I am. The React community has pretty much violated all of the old rules about building out web stuff in some way or another. And what's interesting is the more I've worked along those paths, the more I've sort of liked their violations of the rules and think it makes sense in some way. Anyways, I'll post another page, probably more complex, for you guys to work on for the next class as well, to try and break down into just like what would be components. So look at something like this as a model, a pattern, right? Okay, well, we probably have some sort of top level thing, and then what are the patterns? What are the things that get repeated, and what are good names for them in this product, etc. Can I get rid of that entirely? How do I do that? Let me see. Anyways, I hope that was like a useful thing. Again, I think it's really useful to be able to think that way, because when you start building out applications with React, one of the major challenges is being able to think about, how do I break this down? What are the components? What are the pieces that make this work? And so practicing that, yeah, you're gonna have a lot of challenges with the coding, but practicing that I think is really useful, because it's going to make your coding hopefully go more smoothly, because you're learning to break stuff down into these small pieces. All right. So with that done, let's talk about the major concept I want to cover today, which is going to be the concept of component state, right? We've done some components already, but they're all functional components. And one of the interesting things about them, or uninteresting things, that I've already said, is you can't change the props, right? You can't, props are these static things. You pass the props into your component. And if you want to re-render your component with different props, you can, but you can't actually change the value of the props in them. So the components themselves have no state. So what if we wanted to have a stateful application, right? It wasn't just static data, but the application needs to change over time. How do we accomplish that? And really, the major way to accomplish that, at least traditionally, and this is what we're going to focus on this class, is class components, is how you're going to be able to succeed at adding state. But I'm going to give an example of, and I'll just work this from scratch. I'll do an example of doing some stateful logic with React without a class component first, to sort of show you what it looks like and why there's a challenge that you need something else to help you overcome, right? And for that, I'll just do what I would say is probably like the canonical. Oh, nice. I'll do like the canonical version of a stateful component example for React, which, let me see if I have a folder with this name. I don't have stopwatch. All right, so this should work. So I'm just gonna, and I'm doing it all from scratch again. Man, it's horrible down there, and still very, this projector is still going bad, but I like to do this stuff from scratch so you can see this pattern over and over. But we'll just call this a button click counter. So it's something very, very simple. Like, this is one of the most canonical examples that we tend to do in a lot of React applications, which is basically what we're going to build out is just a button that's just going to tell you how many times it's been clicked. So each time somebody clicks the button, we want to keep track of that and increment a counter that we're going to render, so you can see how many times the button has been clicked since the application has, or that page is loaded. Questions about that? Hopefully not. Should be pretty simple. Anybody have any ideas about how we're going to do that right now, given the React tools that we have at our disposal? Like, how could we accomplish this with what we already have in our React toolbox? So while this is pulling down all the dependencies and stuff, let's think about that for a minute. If you get any good ideas, let me know. What? How? So what we want is we're going to render a button on the screen, and every time the user clicks, we're also going to render a counter, right? That says like times clicked. And every time the user clicks the button, we want that counter to increment.
So we need to render a button and the times clicked, but we also need to render it on click of it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Adds one to the accounting.
Yep. Yeah. You've got the basic details. This never works, does it? When I do code dot, you never work, even though you're supposed to. All right, I'm just gonna open a new window. No, I don't care. So we're gonna open this button click counter project, which is just this basic React project. Nothing fancy going on. Same as any one of our other Create React app guys. We're gonna go into our app.js file, of course. And we're gonna start modifying some stuff in there. Here, let me shift where things are around a little bit. Because I'm not running it yet, so let me get it running. npm start, so that it's running the application. We'll get it loaded and see what's going on as we make changes. This sort of live update. Should be streaming, right? Yeah, just making sure. Yeah. All right, so we've got our application, and it's our existing Create React app, right? So let's strip this stuff down. I don't want all of this. App bit, I'm gonna have a div. I'm gonna get rid of all this other garbage. I don't need to import the logo because we're not using it anymore. And then we're gonna render a button. And the button's just going to say, I don't know, click me or something. And then we're gonna render something here that says, this will just be a div, and it will say times clicked. And right now we'll just put 0 there because we're gonna figure out how to make this work. Let's see what we have. All right, we've got a little button here, super tiny. Let's zoom in a little. There we go. As much as I can, 500% zoom. There we go, I maxed it out. All right. But it doesn't do anything when we click it, right? Because we don't have an on click. All right, so we need to add an on click to our button. And again, this sort of goes back to what we talked a little bit about. You can hook up event handlers just by coding them in right into it, which is almost old school style. So what do we want to do when we click the button? Add one. All right, so maybe let's create a function here. Add one. Okay, so let's go back and so let's say we need a variable. Times clicked is 0. So before we even add this on click, because I like to do stuff in the smallest pieces I can, let's switch this code here to now render times clicked, right? So now it's rendering the value of that when we render the component. Let's see if this works. Looks like it does, because rendering 0. Well, let's test it. You want to see? Let's. Yeah, it's getting that value. So we're good. Yeah, this when you put the curly braces, what that'll do is that lets you write arbitrary JavaScript in here, and it will interpret it. So now we want to have this add one, right? And what we want add one to do is we want to, yes, increment times clicked, right? All right. And now we need to hook that add one up. So on our on click here, we want it to call add one, right? And that's just a reference right to the function. So let's see what we have here. I put the curly braces. What? No, because it's actually a reference. What we're doing is we're saying this function will be a reference to this function. And so it's basically just renaming the function to onClick in here. If you want me to prove that real fast, here, let me do it this way, because if I invoked it here, that would be calling it once and assigning the result of evaluating that to onClick, which would actually be undefined instead of it. But what you'll see is times clicked once forever, because it called it once before it actually rendered. And so then when it reads that times clicked value, it's 1. I can show you that also this way. So this is going to be, I'm just going to create an arrow function that says, oh, when you click, onClick actually runs this function each time, which will run add1. Yeah. But all we're doing is passing a reference to this function. We're not executing the function right then, right? Oh, this is very common. But sure enough, we're not changing our value, right? And the reason, let me pull up the React tools over here, because we've got a great little thing that I can turn on. Let me see if it should still exist, I believe. Where are you? Highlight updates. So if I click this highlight updates button, anytime that any of the React elements re-render, it's going to highlight them in our view over here, right? And what we see is nothing's re-rendering whenever we click stuff. We're not actually re-rendering. But let me add one other bit to this bit of logic. So I did this arrow function. I say I'm calling add1 when I click, right? Now let me make this more than one step of code. And in fact, in order to make this a little easier to, or let me just put it up in the add1. In add1, I'm going to say console.log so this is my test to say, is my function being called, right? And I can, all right, if I'm over here, I can pull up the console down here, actually. I do that using escape so that I can have more than one thing. So we can still see if stuff is re-rendering, and we'll see what our function's being called. Sure enough, our function's being called every time I click it. Why is the value not changing? This is the key bit about React and functional components. Nope. It's because this function, the app function or component, gets invoked only when it gets rendered, and it doesn't get re-invoked just because it doesn't magically know, like, oh, I need to check if this times click variable has changed. What happens is, at this point in time, here at this React DOM.render, where it says render my app, it basically calls this function with whatever the state of everything is at that point in time and has already rendered it. And it doesn't know that it needs to re-render from this app. What?
Is there like a conflict to force it to render as well? Like,
not really. And that's why I was talking about state and functional components. So here's what we're going to do here to make this work, right? As a functional component, is we're going to have to jump through a little bit of a hoop here. We're going to have to change the way that we compose this a little bit. Where what I'm going to do is, first off, I'm going to, we will have this onClick here eventually, and we will have this times click. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pass props. Well, hold on. I'm going to move all this stuff right now over into the other file for the time being, into our index.js. And part of that's just me being lazy. I don't want to have to reference them another way, but I'm going to move it over here. And then in my app, I'm going to pass a times clicked property, which is just the value of times clicked. Now the add1 isn't going to work, and I need to clean up my references here because my onClick here won't work right now. And my div, this can no longer just be times clicked. I need to have a props. That needs to be props.times clicked because I'm passing that into my component now, right? And this isn't done, don't worry. Like, I know you're thinking we didn't change anything. Basically, we didn't, you're right. And so what we'll see is, well, it's just times click 0 because we're not even doing anything when we click right now, right? So let's also pass in an on click to my app, which we're just going to call that add one. All right. And now I can put that back on my button. On click on my button just equals the props.onClick that I passed in. So now let's see what's happening here.
So you're setting the property value in the .js file,
Is where I'm calling it, yep.
instead of just doing like default props or types of props.
Yeah.
Actual app.
But let's see, because we still haven't fixed our problem, right? And that's because it is a sort of complex problem. So we can see, sure enough, we're getting the clicks now again. But our number here isn't updating, right? So why are we not updating? That's because it still doesn't know to re-render when this value changed. It doesn't realize, oh, I need to re-render my application each time. So now I'm going to make this even more fun and complicated. I'm going to take this whole call to React DOM.render. I'm just going to make a function. I could do this a lot of different ways, but I'm just going to make a function called render. And I'm going to put this inside of it. And then initially down here, I'm just going to call render so that I get an initial render. And then anytime add one gets clicked, I need to call render again because I need to re-render my application. Otherwise, it's like I basically have to recall the function, like the whole function thing needs to get called.
I feel like it's too complicated. It shouldn't be.
And so now, let's see, yay! And we can see, if you look here, stuff is blinking because, oh, let me see. You can see stuff's blinking down there or whatever because stuff is updating, right? Yay, here's the value changing every time.
This isn't a common thing.
No, this isn't very common. I'm showing you this because we're going to show how to work with class components, which have their own state. And I'm showing you the challenge that you have if you try to do stateful stuff without a class component first, right? Now, class component state is complicated. It is confusing as well, but this is sort of that gotcha. This is emphasizing how React works. So hopefully this helps click some thoughts about what's actually happening with React as well, which is why I walked through it, which is that, you know, nothing is dynamically bound. So if you're familiar with anyone who's ever worked with a lot of other JavaScript, like front-end frameworks like Angular, they do all sorts of magical two-way binding things where like, oh, if the value changed here, it automatically updates here. If it changed here, it automatically updates here. React has none of that built into it. It says, oh, if you want to re-render because the value changed, then you need to re-render. Like, you need to control that data flow.
I feel like there should be an easier way than forcing it. Like there should be like an auto update rendering thing going on. Is there a way to do that?
Not with classic functional components. They've got a whole new way to do some weird stuff that I won't get into, called hooks that sort of capture something like that. But yeah, hooks are cool and magic, and I still don't understand how they work. Well, they sort of violate, like I mean, not violate, but they force you to rethink like fundamental programming concepts, like because functions should be stateless, where like if I call a function again another time, it shouldn't it shouldn't change the way it works, and hooks sort of let a function change the way it works, and like so they're a little weird. Yeah, we're sort of emphasizing that a little bit because functional components can't have their like a state in themselves, right? They don't get to manage their state, at least not traditionally. All they get to do is take in their input and render, right? That's exactly why this wasn't able to update our values, because it had already rendered once. Like, it had been called with whatever you passed in. It doesn't know that those other things changed. So we had to invoke it all again by doing this call to render, jumping through hoops. So we're going to come back to this exact example and show how to write this same example using a class component in just a few minutes. But first, let's just talk about class components. Whoa! There we go. What? Yeah, 500%. Yeah.
And this is way faster, probably about it. But so like I was reading function and class components.
I would be careful with that. Well, yeah, some people don't like dumb and smart in the first place. I tend to use fallback on that because it's easier to remember, but not necessarily true. That's a lot of times, so the statement was that functional components are frequently referred to as dumb components and class components as smart components. That gets intermixed a lot with another concept, because a lot of times when people are working with React, they're using a state management application or framework instead of React. So for example, Redux, which I've used very heavily. And when you're working with Redux instead of just React stuff, then you'll have what people may call dumb or smart components, or they might call connected or unconnected, or presentation or container components. So you hear all of that terminology used. And basically what that means with like any of that is a component that has some sort of extra connected logic about state or not. And a functional component or a class component can be, I mean, class ones are weird. I would encourage you, if you have a stateless component, to write them as functional just to keep it simpler. But class components can be, more or less stateless if you just don't do anything with state in them. And class components can be, at least in the Redux connected model, you can have dumb class components and smart class components, but you can't, again, in the classic Redux model, not talking about hooks, you can't have smart functional components because they can't be connected the same way. But you can do that with class components. So there's a lot of different layers of terminology intermingling when they talk about components that way. I prefer to stick with like this stateless versus stateful, because especially now that they've introduced hooks, it's easier, because you might say that eventually functional component can be a stateful functional component. But stateless, again, just means that it doesn't maintain any of its own internal state, that anything that it knows to do came from outside of it, that it can't change something inside of itself that changes how it renders. So let's just look at class components a little bit, right? We did a review of class, JavaScript classes, a couple classes ago. This is a basic welcome component as a class component, right? This shouldn't look much different than, say, something that we've already done, except we've got a few little bits here. Here, instead of it just being function welcome, it's class welcome. It extends React.component, and that's one of the important parts, because a lot of the class component functionality is actually coming from the React component base class or superclass, but you just don't work with it that often. And then the rendering, what you're actually outputting, is inside of a render method in your class or object instead of just being returned directly. And the other difference is any properties you want to reference, instead of props directly, it's this dot props.
For some reason, the way they have this set up, the classes reminds me a lot of Java. Because Java, everything you did was basically inside the class.
Yeah, it is. Now, how do you get to a class component from a functional component? This is a great page to like snapshot or just remember. This is like a 5-step process. If you've got a class component, you decide you're going to need some state on it. Here's the steps you need to take to move from a functional component to a class component. We'll be referring back to this as we work through stuff today as well. First, you create an ES6 class with the same name as your function that extends React.component. Then you add a single empty method to it called render. Then you move the body of the functional component into that render method that you have. Replace any references to props with this dot props in your render body, and then delete that remaining function declaration. And then what you've, just by doing those sort of 5 steps, you've gone from having a function component to a class component. Nothing else has changed about how it works. You invoke it the same way. You know, React will more or less treat them very similarly. It's a pretty smooth transition. Questions on that?
They were the exact same fights. I still understand.
Some people have argued in the past that they weren't, because they weren't as efficient for a while. Class components were more efficient for React over the long run. But a lot of it is readability, or a lot of it is, if you will, like protection, like, or the way you want to think about stuff, because the goal is to say, like, should this ever have state? Do I care about this having that? And it's sort of a protection to say, oh, this should just be rendering something, and I now get to worry about it way less because it just renders something. I don't have to think about whether or not there's state on this. I don't have to think about all this extra complexity. It's just a render. Like it creates some DOM elements or something, right? All right, so there is, I don't know if people actually, you know, I was working through stuff manually myself instead of doing this, but there is like official links to the different steps for that Thinking in React project that exist. And so I don't know if you guys would rather do this right now in class as a hands-on exercise, or if you'd rather do it afterwards, but you go to this link right here, and what you'll have is this is my version. You could also go to one straight from the Thinking in React page, because I think they have one too of the functional versions of these. But this is a functional component version that I copied straight from the React, Thinking in React page of all of the different components that you need for the Thinking in React code, right? And what I want to encourage everyone to do, just sort of practice, is just convert every one of these to a class component. So, you know, the logic, nothing about the logic needs to change, nothing about anything else needs to change. But as an exercise, a practice exercise to get used to being able to go through that process, is walk through these steps for each one of those components and convert them to a class-based component, and just make sure that everything's still working after you've done that. The question I would have right now is, would you rather do that now in class or as an exercise after class so that we keep moving through some more material? In class?
No.
What?
No.
I like having work to do outside of class because it keeps it fresh. That's just my
I'm gonna work after this, so I'll probably
Take a vote.
Now, who wants to work on it now? All right. I think it's that. I think it wins. So we're going to, what I'll do is I'll set a timer for anybody who's remote, so that you know how long we're going to work on this. Hopefully it's not too long. Let me go back to this URL so you guys can navigate to this page. Once you guys have, I'll leave this up for a couple minutes, and then we will, or maybe a minute or so, and then I'll switch back to those steps so that you guys have those visible as you're working through stuff. Oh yeah, I can just put this in Slack. Let me make everyone's life easy. You can just click it. Now you'll have to have your own copies if you're working on this or whatever, but you guys should be able to work.
Why do you have it set up for you that way? Everything's to the side instead of like in the middle on the
I don't know. I don't know what I did.
No, because all of ours is set up. You can actually change the view. You can change the view.
Oh, there's a change view button up here. All right, so let's. I'll just do like a standard timer here. We'll do like 10 minutes. You know, if we finish earlier than that, people finish earlier than that, that's great. The problem is, obviously, I can't have this up at the same time I have the instructions up. So I'll leave the instructions up and we'll just hear the beep in about 10 minutes. But the goal is to try and just work through and convert these over to class components, just to get a little practice with this so you're not intimidated by them. Yeah. Well, we've got an example of a class right here. I mean, it'll be almost similar to this. Though I only put this up for the syntax, right? Because otherwise, these are all the steps you need to convert. But you just need to have class, the name of your component, extends React.component. Yeah. Yep. That's why I've got those 5 steps there. It's pretty much like follow those 5 steps. I'll switch back to the steps in just a second so that people have a chance to make sure they've got this class bit of syntax as well.
I think I'm confused.
Okay.
So anything that says prop that like props on product needs to be changed to this dot com.
Yeah. Look, you guys are going to have homework after all. Seems like we may not work through it. So.
It's good, you have to, you have to. You can't just
I think if you save it, it'll save it to a generic new one. What?
You say, like, if we were to say yours.
It'll make your own. Yeah, it'll rename the URL, I believe.
What is it happening?
One of the things I don't like about CodePen's great to start something up, but it gives you almost no feedback when it's broken, which is a real pain. What? Yeah, it's really that's why it's not a great environment to do all of your work in, is because if something's going wrong, you get almost nothing. I can give you a longer cable if you need it to plug in. Okay, I was like, there's some extension cables back here that I could.
Oh, yeah, it's really weird about the extension cables, so extension cables over here.
Oh yeah.
Scary stuff.
It's janky.
That makes me.
All right, I think I mentioned something. I'm just not sure what it is. So, class. What time we on that?
Not enough.
Not enough.
Damn, man.
2.5 minutes. I'm not gonna work through it. You guys are gonna have to keep working on it. I'm not solving this in class today. You guys should feel good. You're like, I've got one error, man. I remember when I first started coding in college and we did C++ and you go to compile your app and it's like 100 lines of code and it comes back and it's like 600 some errors. And you're like, so I should just burn the computer down? I don't know what I do. Even better, after it does all that for you, you find out you're missing like a semicolon somewhere, and then it completely compiles. You were like, there weren't 600 errors. You lied to me. I did that in an interview once. I coded up an infinite loop. The funny part was they're literally like warning me as I'm like, and then you'll do this, and they're like, and what about? And I'm like, but they, oh crap, it's an infinite loop. It's running forever.
I feel like that's gonna happen to me when I start doing. I'm just gonna pull some Dutch shenanigans like that. I was like, oh, you work everything.
That was actually at the place I'm currently at. I coded up an infinite loop in the interview. So.
Yeah, I hate how I'm having it individually, like, it's everything right now.
Yeah.
It's making ads inside.
If you just had an awesome editor like Visual Studio Code, you could just tell it to format your file and it would format it all nicely for you.
That would be nice, but you know, that's in the person's world. This computer is not perfect.
Don't worry about years. I can't figure some shit out.
Oh, that happened to me one time. I was writing a project.
Oh, all right.
No.
Oh, it's time.
It's time.
No. I'm so close. I'm just dipping right now. Just dipping.
I mean, some of you got at least some of them working, right? Did anybody get none of them moved over to a class yet?
I believe something, and I'm still having, I have like a round. Was it fine?
We're just saying class, say product category rows, we're changing the name of the function. The name of the function that we originally had, we put it into a class, and then we can still have our props, extends React component, and then render, and then we still have our constant category equals, now I changed it to just props, I thought I just had props before, and keep everything that was in the function the way it was.
Close. I think I heard a couple things that were a little off there, which was I can let me take a look real fast because I think I heard a couple things that were off that was getting correct.
Started off the right way.
Right. So this doesn't have any drops. That's what I heard. That's going to be like cast in. Yeah, I think the rest of that is probably see if you have turn stuff there.
So we're gonna do the same format on the way through.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So you guys can keep working on this to finish moving it over at home. Look, we got a compromise. Some work at home and some here. But I want to make sure that we have time to move on to some of the other work. So let's get into this aspect. We talked about just the basics of a class component now, right? We converted stuff over, but we didn't do anything different. So how do we add state? How does state work? And that's really what the second half of this class will be on today is got a class component, how do we put state into it, right? So here's a basic example of a class with some state. So I'm gonna go ahead and just, well, I don't even know if I'll render this or whatever, but basically what we've got in this is, here we've got a constructor. And remember we talked about how that'll get called when this component gets rendered. Maybe I will move this over into something. Let me see, where can I put it that I'm not going to break anything I don't care about? Let's just render it in my app that I'm working on here for now. Even though, you know, we'll get rid of it in a minute, but I'll just put this here for the time being. We've got a person. Let me change this line. React DOM dot render, dot render, and we're just going to render our person, and that's just going to go to our document dot get element by ID root, like we were doing. All right. So I changed my app just to render this person object or component, right? And that should, let's see here. Hello, I'm Dot. I'm a little tired today. Oh, we're missing something on our person because we didn't pass a prop in, right? Oh, it needs a name, prop. Name equals Jared. Hello, I'm Jared. I'm a little tired today. And one thing, so I want to clarify something here because it might be a little misleading. I just realized. You see me change that value and save, and then it renders with the new value. And what I was saying before was, you know, it won't do that for props. You have to have state. That's not actually React doing the render. That's our, when we did that npm start call, it's running a web server on the background, and that web server is monitoring any files that we have. And if we change the files, it re-renders our whole web app for us. So it's basically re-rendering the web app when we change that stuff. So that's outside of our React cycle. That's like another level up. It's like you're refreshing the web page every time. But our web browser, our engine from npm start is managing that for us. It's called hot reloading, and it's freaking awesome. But what we've got here is a pretty simple component with some state now. So we're still passing in a prop like we could to any component. And we're even using that prop in our render method right here, this .props.name. But inside of our constructor, we're setting something else, this .state. And we're putting a value on it. So here's some, this is how, like, any state that you have on your components will be on, it's on the state property for that object. So that's why I did this .state right here. And that's how you would set any state initially. This is sort of initialization of some state, right? All right, that's all great, but this is no different than what we had before because it's still static, right? How can we actually change it over time without re-rendering our whole component? So this is how you do the same thing we were talking about before. You do this on-click behavior. So let's hook something up here. I'm going to, I don't know. We'll rewrite our click counter in a second too, but let's hook one up to this first, just because I already have it here. Change mood. So we've added a button, very simple. It doesn't do anything right now. It's just this change mood button that we added in, right? Nothing happens when we click it. So now I'm going to add some sort of on-click behavior to it. And this is where we'll get different than what we were doing before. Because before we had an external function. For this on-click, I'm going to do something inside of my class itself. I'm going to add something. I'm going to call this just change mood. It's going to be another method on here. And inside of here, it's going to do something. Right now, I'll just do console.log. And this is just to show that something's happening. But this on-click here, since this is on our object, we still need to refer to it, this dot change mood. That's what we want to call when the button gets clicked, is we want to call this local method right here. All right, let's see if that works. Pull up our console here. And when we click it, sure enough, we see that it's saying our mood changed. Right? But we're not changing a value yet, right? So there's a couple other things that we need to do to properly bind this so that we can change values. First, there's going to be a sort of magic line. For now, just call this magic. Yes, you'll see newer tutorials that say don't do this or some other stuff. But for now, this is going to be a bit of just trust. It's something you need to do. this dot change mood equals this dot change mood dot bind this. Is- I'm binding it to the object so that it maintains the right context, because this can change context in JavaScript where it can't in other languages. So this is like, for now, don't worry about that too much. This is just one of those strings like, oh, if I'm hooking up an event handler of some kind in my component, this is just sort of a magic string. You have to put something like this to make sure that it will work correctly. Not all the time, you'll have times where it works because it depends on what you're doing, but it's just sort of a best practice. And then here, what we're going to do is we can't just, this is important here, we can't just change the states, right? We could say, oh, I just want to change my states to be, I don't know, happy or something, right? And you would think that might work, but it even gives me a warning here because I've got tooling. Hey, thank goodness I've got stuff that helps guard me against it. But this is not going to do what we want. It's going to say mood change, but nothing changed. And that's because you can't change, and I'll have these on the slides in a minute too, but you can't change your state directly. Instead, you have to use this sort of complex set state approach. And there's several different ways to write this. I'm gonna go with just the most basic, which is I'm going to pass it an object with the new state values that I want. So I know in my state I've got a mood, and I want to say, oh, it's going to be happy now or something, right? So now it actually changed my state when I clicked that. And if I click it again, it's still re-rendering, it's still setting the state value, but I didn't like have it rotate through anything, right? So it's always going back to the same one. So there's a few weird steps involved here, but here's our event handler. It's actually going to do something. Here's where we hooked it up. That looks all similar to the onClick that we had for our counter before. And then the set state is the sort of gotcha bit of what we're setting. And then I initialized it up here and have my little magic bit. And I can't remember if my slides mention what's actually happening. If not, we will talk more about it in much more detail. But what I'm going to do now is let's basically ignore that guy. And let's do this one more time. But this time for our times clicked in our app bit. And what we're going to do is now we can take this bit of code that we have, and we're going to move it back out of here over into our app in just a moment, because our app is going to be our stateful component. So we want to convert our app to manage its own state instead of up there. So, all right, how am I going to do this? Well, I already walked through the steps, right? I'm going to create a class called app that extends react.component. We're going to add a render method to it. Inside that render method, we'll take everything that was inside our previous functional component. We're going to put it here. Anything that was props needs to be this dot props now.
Quick question, while you're right here.
And then I can delete this. Yes.
So you only add this where a props is.
Yes.
You only add this before that, so for
Another variable.
I don't put this only for the ones that have props.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Well, if you're referencing another variable inside of a functional component that's not one of the props passed in, then it's got to be like a global reference or a reference to something outside of its scope. And so you would still reference it the same way otherwise. So now let's check. This should work the same as we did before, and it is updating because all of our logic is still in place. All we did was convert it to a class component, right? We didn't actually change where anything lived. Now we're going to change where our code lives. We're going to add a constructor. in that, we're going to call the supers constructor the constructor for React.component, essentially. And then, oh, it's telling me it's useless because I'm not doing anything in there. Look at you, give me a warning. Now I'm going to add some state, and the state I want is this is going to manage its own times clicked instead of somewhere else. So now it's not something that's in, I like to put a space between my arguments in my classes. So it's not managed something that's going to get passed in, it's going to be internal. So now I'll change this reference to be my state, not the prop that gets passed in. And this should be working, except times clicked won't be updated, right? Because yes, it's getting updated, it's getting the prop passed in, but it's not rendering that prop, it's rendering the state value now. So now what we can do, now we want to change all of this. Well, my on click, I'll bind this to something local as well. So we'll just call it increment counter this time. And what this will do is we need this to update the number of times clicked. This is pretty much going to be this sort of logic, except we can't do it that easily. I'll grab the console log. To the times clicked state property. And then in order to update my state, I need to do this dot state or set state. And what I want to do is increment the times clicked here, right? And this is actually, I'm going to do something that is not exactly best practice, but it's sort of okay for now. I'm going to say what I want times clicked, the new value to be, because I'm just passing in an object here. Since this increment counter is a method, I have access to everything on my object, or should. So I'm going to reference the state dot times clicked plus 1. So essentially what I'm saying is, okay, it's like, oh, I can't do that there. That's right, because this is an object. So there's a little bit of nested bit logic here. Let me pull it out a little bit because it might make it easier to see what's going on. Is I'm creating a new state object, and that new state object has a times clicked property that's just getting set to whatever the value of the current state's time click is plus 1. And then I'm passing that in to set state. And this is also just a hair misleading. You'll see that in a second. But so what that'll do is update my state every time we click something. And now I can change this. I don't want to trigger what got passed in when we click. I want to do increment counter. But I am missing one thing that I mentioned from my previous bit. Whenever I have a method or an event handler, anybody remember what it was? You need to put something in my constructor for each event handler. I need to do my bind. I'm missing my bind here, which is the way to make sure that it's going to work correctly. So I need to do this dot increment counter equals this dot increment counter dot bind to this. I know it's weird, it's convoluted, don't worry too much about it. But basically, let me give a short summary of what this does. Putting this in means that any reference to this inside of this callback will work correctly. Otherwise, references to this will be wrong. That's what that's doing. All right, so let's try this and see what happens. Awesome, we're getting updated now. And we can go back to here and delete all this stuff because we're not doing that. Let me minimize this person. And I don't need this render bit, and oops, I need that. And this, because I'm actually only rendering once, and I don't even need to pass in these properties because everything's been contained inside of that app component instead, managing its state. And I don't expect you to get every bit of how that's working right now, because there's a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of what React's doing. We're definitely going to talk more about that in the next class as well. But are there any questions so far? None? Yes.
In the event handler, you need to find it. Say like you wanted to, set on click, you wanted to maybe do something different with the button.
Right.
You need to like use the line.
You need to bind the function that's going to be called once. So let's say you want to, I don't know, on the button, on hover, or on mouse enter. You want to trigger increment counter as well, right? Which is going to be weird, but you could do that. But if increment counter is the backing method that you're calling, you don't need to bind it like a second time, because we could add that in here. We could say like on mouse enter equals this dot increment counter. And that's still a reference to this same method, which is already properly bound. Now, if we had a different method that we wanted to call, we have to bind that method too. Yeah, so now our stuff's gonna be really weird, because every time you go into it, it's just, yeah, well, because I have on mouse enter updating my times clicked, so. Because I added it here as well as an event handler for that. Other questions right now? There's some magic going on here. There is. Oh, back to proper zoom. Oh, look, I already talked about how we changed the state. I worked through that example. What was that line with bind that I added to the constructor about? For now, just think of it as a special bit of code required for any methods that use this somewhere in their code. Right? If your method uses this, you should do that bind. Yes. What do props do? That's just a way to pass in values to your component. So you know how in the past in the function, you can have arguments to your function? And that's how you pass in values so that your function can be generic but do something different based off those values. Props are pretty much the same thing, except they all get passed in as one object, the first argument to your, if it's a functional component, the first one. But in a class component, they get passed in. I don't know how React passes them in, but passes them in as a props object as well. So it's just a way to pass in values into your components, but they're static and you can't change them. They're not internal to it. Does that make sense? Not necessarily global, but it's one time in the sense that, I mean, with a functional component it makes sense because you can't change the values inside of your function while it's work because it's already rendered, right? It's done. The code ran. With the class components, that's where it takes a little more clarity to just say like the props can never change over the life cycle of that rendering of the class. And I say that very carefully. They can be changed by like a parent component passing in different, or a parent thing passing new props in, but they can't be changed internally. That's what state is for.
Can't it like decide what kinds of information you can take into? Like it has to be like either a string or it has to be a number or something like that. It takes information.
You can designate what the prop types are. So like that's sort of a best practice. That's making sure that your component, people are using stuff the way you expect it to be used. Like, oh, this should be a number. This should be a string. This should be an object with these prop like things or whatever.
So they're also the properties of like the properties of an object.
Sort of, yeah.
Okay.
Can you repeat what you were asking?
Oh, how does props connect to everything else in the?
How do I like try to explain it? I mean, in a sense, they don't like they're only related to that component. They're not related to anything else. So you could think of it like I've described stuff in different ways, right? How do I even describe it? I try to have like some sort of analogy or something almost, right? Props usually are handed down from higher level components and then just keep getting passed down or generated somewhere higher up. And each time a component gets rendered, it can have a whole different set of props get passed into it, but it only, man, I can't think of a good, I'm trying to think of a good real world example that's gonna make sense and not be misleading too much. I have to think of how to describe it a little differently, I guess. But props, like the props in one component don't directly relate to any other components or anything else. They're only related to rendering that component.
I'm just not sure how it passes through the, like, so, like, because in a code, props just like appears, and I don't understand why it just appear there.
Let me see. I mean, I guess the best I can say is it's just like the attributes or the properties of a function, right? So like, have you done like algebra or something, right? So if you have x, what would it be like? What would it need to be? X plus 5 equals y, right? Let's say, as like an equation. And then you call that with x of 5. Then you can compute what your y is, right? Because you basically you passed in a property for your function, right? But what's nice is that's basically a function that lets you add 5 to anything, you know, because you can change what that x is and just call it again. And you can make that much more complex rather than just plus 5. That's what the props are like too. It's just a way to pass in some values into each component so that it renders different each time. Like just sort of like a function can take different arguments and render, you know, return different results. It works the same way for props. They just put them all on one object instead of having them be a list of them because they wanted to be able to have both class components and functional components, and you wouldn't be able to have a arbitrary list of arguments to a class component that would work correctly, I believe. So, you know, by making them an object instead of an object called props instead of just a list of arguments, it's easier to work with.
So, like, when it says props, it's like all the other code and the.
Props is anything that gets passed in for, so like this on click is actually a prop that we just passed into our button. Or earlier, you know, on our app here, let me see, times clicked and on click are both props that we passed into the app. So then they're just values. So it's like we're calling an app function and passing in times clicked and add 1 as 2 arguments to the function. It's just a different syntax to pretty much do that same type of thing. I'll have to, like, if it's not, you're not getting there with that, I'll probably have to sit down and try and explain it again separately. Because maybe I missed something in the description or like just trying to cover how they're related, I think.
And why does sometimes, like, in the back, can you?
Yeah.
Why does sometimes in the from not printer does that, like, the first thing have, sometimes it has a cozy.
Yes.
And sometimes.
Oh, that goes back to what I was talking about in the first class where I talked, or the JSX class. So if you watch that one, it should explain it again. But every element, every React element has to have a closing tag. So you have to either be, so if we go over here and look at our app, right, we've got a div, and here's the closing tag for it, which is this /div that wraps it. So that's a requirement. And if you don't, like if it's doesn't need a closing tag because you're not passing anything into it, there's no children, then you can self-close it by putting this / at the end of it instead. So you'll notice there's no, I could rewrite this as /app. That's the same thing, but it's just longer, right? And I'm not passing anything in as the children to my app component. So instead, it's just shorter for me to write it that way.
But why is it like
It has to. This is self-closing. This is saying like this is the closing of it, whereas that's the same as this.
no, like sometimes it'll just be like without a certain tag.
It should never have that. That's invalid JSX. That's not correct. Yeah, that would be wrong. Everything has to have this closing somewhere for it to be valid JSX. What?
The only time I haven't seen it tag is when somebody's trying to set quickly here instead of the component area that you're doing.
Yeah.
That's the only time I've seen it.
But yeah, it should, that would actually generate an error, I believe. Everything has to have a closing tag or a closing aspect to it. And if it doesn't, it's invalid JSX syntax, so. All right, well, we're not gonna have, I was going to potentially work through this. I think it might take a little too long right now because I like to try and keep stuff not quite at the 2 hours. It's a long class. But I've got a link to a completed version here and then an uncompleted version. This is just what I was gonna do is convert this heroes renderer that just renders a list of heroes. And if you hover over them, it sort of shows their real name. Which by the way, I saw Spider-Man Far From Home last night. Great, if people haven't seen it.
I finally just watched it.
Oh, that movie is great too. Yeah. Spider-Man Far From Home. I thought it was really good. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I think a lot of the old Spider-Man movies were great. Well, Spider-Man 3, yes. I mean, Spider-Man 3 wasn't great, but 1 and 2 were great. And at least, I'll give them this. At least in the Sam Raimi Spider-Mans or the old Spider-Mans, the villains had complex reasoning. It's like Doc Ock is like, man, I really want to like save the world. I got to make it a better place. It's got to be able to rescue people. No matter what it costs to do this, I have to build this energy source. And a lot of the new ones, it's like, what's your reasoning? Well, I'm just angry. Want to be mad. What? Yeah, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe does a lot of things right, but their villains can frequently be one-dimensional. What? Yeah. All right, so we're not going to work through this like in this class right now because I want to make sure I go over the rest of the slides and get that stuff covered. But I was going to work through, and maybe I'll we'll work through it next time, or maybe we'll just do a video or something of sort of converting this to a class component with some state so that it'll know if you've clicked on them and then like show their real name right next to them. Just as another example of working through one of these to add some state to a component. The link to the completed version is what's in the slides, not to the uncompleted version, because I worked through it and solved it last class, and so I forgot to save like as a new version. And here's the steps that I'm gonna go through, whatever, as well. So I'm gonna skip that a little bit, but let's do a pop quiz then, real fast. Just a couple questions. How do you set props on a React component? How do you set the props?
About G.
What?
In a functional.
When you say set props, I keep thinking about like default props equals bracket or braces, blank, like the name of the variable that you're trying to call, colon, value, that's what I'm thinking of.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's how you set a default, but you pass them in.
Okay.
That's the only way to set props. You pass them in as arguments in your JSX, or if you're not using JSX, the other syntax, but pretty much everyone uses JSX, right? You can't set props in your component. You can't set props any other way than passing them into it when you render it. That's the only way to set the props. Can you change the value of a prop within a component? No, you should never change the value of a prop within a component, right? Because it doesn't know that you changed the value. It expects it rendered, it expects it to be that. So changing the value of a prop within a component, it's a common mistake to make, but don't do it. So now let's talk about some notes on state, some things that you need to know about how state works with React components. I already said this, emphasized it several times, but big old bold text, do not modify state directly. You can't modify the state object directly. It doesn't work the way you think. Always use the set state method. And we'll get into a little bit of why in the next class, because we're going to talk about the React lifecycle. I need to update my slides because the React lifecycle has technically changed. I might show the old lifecycle because I think it was a little clearer, and then the new one. If you try to set the state by directly changing the property value, then React will not know to re-render with the new state. State, here's the part where I said I was a little misleading when I called something new state before. State updates are actually merged into the existing state object. They're not a replacement for it when you do set state. So that means you don't have to set every state property when you're changing just one state property. So let me show that real fast because that's a little bit of a tricky thing, but I think it's much easier to see in code than it is to see elsewhere, right? So let's just add another value to this state, something we don't care about. Is functional true, right? So we just added another value to our state when we declared it originally, right? And if we go over here and look at our component, look at our application, let's go down to the, oh, here's my app, it's the app, right? So we can see our state here. It's got is functional true and times click 0 as our state values. And if I click the button, times click becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, but is functional is still true, right? Even though right here, I created a new object with only a times clicked property on it and set that to my state. That's because it didn't actually replace my existing state object. It took that and combined it with my existing state. So it said, oh, the existing state has a times clicked. I'll change the times clicked of the existing state, but I'll leave the is functional value there. I'm not going to just replace the whole thing. So that's really useful because it just means you don't have to, you can have a whole bunch of state if you do on a component, and you only have to change the one thing that you care about in different situations. Does that make sense? All right, this one's another one that, again, I was saying, like, I'm doing stuff simple. There's some misleading bits here, and this will trip you up at some point. State updates may be asynchronous. So the state, React decides when it's actually going to change your state. So when you call set state, it doesn't mean that immediately it's actually changed the state of the components. It might do it later. It could do it tomorrow. It won't do it tomorrow, but it might. But it has a lot of implications, the fact that they're asynchronous. The fact that that state doesn't change immediately. And that includes reading the state immediately after calling set state will probably not produce the expected result because it probably hasn't changed the state yet. And then also relying on the current state when setting the state could potentially not produce the expected result because it may not yet have put the current state into the state that you want it to be in before you're moving to the next state. That's a sort of tricky bit. I think I can show this one. Let me see if this will work. I think it should. So we've got our increment counter where we say we're adding 1 to our state here, right? Let's let's just inline. I'm just going to do concatenation because it'll be easier. I'm going to copy this and we're going to do it again right after we set the state. And we're just going to change it to say added. So we're basically calling that twice every time we click the button right now. Let's see what happens. We'll make this a little bigger. We'll just pull our console up here. Don't need it down there. And then let's see. You notice that even though we've set the state value, when we read it right afterwards, it still has a value of 1. We called set state, but you would think that after we called set state, then if I read this dot state dot times clicked right now, that it's going to have the new value, but it doesn't because it's asynchronous. So it hasn't actually changed the state value yet. So you're not allowed to read it immediately like that. And there's several different versions of the set state function that exist. So if you need to do that, you can use one of the versions that it gets a little tricky, but basically you pass in a callback that says, oh, after you've actually set the state, then run this bit of code. Because then you know that you'll have the correct state values. Woo, giant controls again. All right. So that covers, I mean, we will be working with state more and more. I really encourage you to go read the React documentation on the state as well and working with state. So don't let it be just me walking through things, you know, go hit up the, they're gonna have a lot of stuff in their documentation on state and life cycle. And I encourage you to go read it. Look, they've got the exact same steps. You think I stole it from them? Maybe I did. But they're gonna have this documentation. Please go read their documentation as well, because this is sort of a tricky concept about how some of this stuff works. And so reading over it from several different sources should help a lot in terms of actually clicking versus just having me talk about it up here. And then next class, we're gonna talk about lifecycle, which they mentioned in here a little bit, but we're gonna go through the React lifecycle, the component lifecycle in much more detail to show you what's actually happening with the different types of components when they render on the page. And then hopefully that'll bring a lot of this stuff together in terms of how class components work and functional components and why there's a state and props. It should hopefully help answer some of the questions about how props work and other things as well. But it gets into what React is doing behind the scenes, the magic that it's doing to render all this stuff on your page. All right, we'll see you guys on, well, I won't see you, but chat with you guys on Tuesday, I guess.
And we'll know about Thursday and Saturday,